The werewolf was gone before I reached the tree line. I had ridden back from the veldt crossing with blood on my bracers and the particular silence of a fight that had gone worse than it should. 3 of my border wolves down, 1 dead, the crossing held but barely, and Kale limping from a crossbow bolt that had caught him below the shoulder when he turned to cover my flank. I had pulled the bolt myself in the saddle. I had packed the wound with my own kit, the way a soldier packs a wound, tight, efficient, without tenderness. Kale had let me because he always let me. We had ridden together for 9 years. He had never needed more from me than that. But somewhere between the crossing and the first lanterns of Vorthin's outer village, Kale had dropped out of the column. I did not notice immediately. That is a truth I have never said aloud, because it is not a comfortable truth for a king who runs a border hold on exactness. I was riding at the head of the column, and there were 20 men behind me and a report to make, and my shoulder hurt, where the same crossbow had glanced off my pauldron, and I had not looked back at Kale in perhaps the last half-mile. My Sergeant Draven was the one who said it, my king, the wolf. I turned, the column behind me, horses, torches, the low sound of tired men, no wolf. When, I said. The last bend, I think. I turned my horse out of the column without another word. Draven fell in behind me. I sent him back with a gesture. This was not a matter for witnesses. Kale's trail was easy enough to read. A werewolf does not move lightly, and he was wounded. He had left the road at the bend and gone into the pine margin, moving west, which was wrong. The hold was east. The healers were east. The warm interior kennels where Kale slept on cold nights were east. There was nothing to the west of the road except the village edge. The packless workers' row, the wash houses, the grain store, the small fires of people who did not belong to any pack. Packless? My people technically, Vorthin's marches had always drawn the unranked, the wanderers, the ones who came from nowhere and stayed because the border asked no questions. I fed them, employed them, did not conscript them into pack hierarchy because they had none to enter. I was not cruel to them. I was also not, I will say it plainly, particularly interested in them. A king with a border to hold cannot afford to be interested in everything. I found Kale's blood trail at the pine margin. It was heavier than I expected. The bolt had been out for 2 hours, the packing should have held, but Kale had been running. Wolves run when they are frightened, and wounded wolves run harder, and the packing had shifted. The drops were dark in the torchlight, frequent, and I felt something I did not often feel across 16 years of border kingship. Fear, not the useful kind that sharpens a soldier, the cold, personal kind. I followed the blood into the trees. The village edge was quiet, most windows were dark, the washhouse lantern was out. I moved through the margin slowly, reading the trail by the light of a half-moon through pine boughs, and I was perhaps 40 yards from the last building in the workers' row, a low structure with a water trough outside and ropes strung for drying, when I heard something that made me stop. Not a sound of distress, not the snarl or the high animal cry of a wolf in serious pain, something quieter than that. A voice, low, unhurried, speaking to something that could not answer in words. I was at the tree line by then. I stopped there. Kale was at the trough. He was lying on his side, unusual. Kale did not lie on his side for anyone, with his wounded flank exposed to the night air, and there was a girl kneeling in the mud beside the trough who was working on the wound, with the focused economy of someone who had been doing it long enough that the fear had settled into function. She was not a healer. I could see that from 40 yards. She did not have a healer's kit. She had a wooden basin, a rag, and what looked like a bundle of dried herbs she had been pressing against the wound. She had no rank markings, no pack crest. She was wearing a laundress's wrap over a plain shift, which meant she had come out in a hurry, come out in the middle of the night in a laundress's working wrap because something had come to the trough, and she had not been able to leave it there. Kale's tail was flat on the ground. He was not comfortable. The wound hurt and he was frightened in the way that wounded animals are frightened, that body-level fear that has nothing to do with courage. But he was still. She had gotten him still. 9 years. I had never seen anyone except myself get Cale still. I did not step out of the tree line. I do not know exactly when I decided to stay where I was. It was not a decision the way strategic decisions are decisions. It was more that my feet stopped and the rest of me caught up with them a moment later. And by then I was watching, and something in the center of my chest had gone very quiet in a way I had no name for, because I was a war king who had spent 16 years making sure nothing in his chest went quiet unless he chose it. She was talking to him. I could hear the sound of it even when I could not make out the words. She was keeping her voice at exactly the pitch a person uses when they want to be heard without startling. She said something I caught only once in those first minutes, clearly. I know it hurts. I know. But you came here, so you must have thought this was better than whatever the other thing was. Cale's ear moved toward her voice. I stood in the trees, and I did not move. She worked on the wound for what must have been the better part of an hour before she got it clean to her satisfaction. I watched her discover, through careful touch, that there was no bolt head still lodged inside. She checked twice, with 2 fingers very gently, and Cale hissed through his teeth each time and did not shift position, which is the only reliable test I know for a wolf's trust. She cleaned the channel. She packed it again with the herbs, yarrow, I thought, and something darker I did not recognize from 40 yards, and she bound it with strips torn from the inner hem of her wrap, which meant she was kneeling in night air in considerably less warmth than she had started with. She did not seem to notice, or she noticed and did not count it as a cost worth mentioning. When the wound was bound, she sat back on her heels and looked at Cale, and Cale looked back at her. There was a long moment of that, the wolf's amber eyes on the girl's face, reading her the way wolves read the things they are deciding about. I had seen Cale do this before. I had seen him do it with my sergeant, with my best outrider, with the head healer of Vorthing Keep who had tended him every winter for 6 years. The reading always ended the same way. Cale would hold the gaze for a moment and then look away, because that was what Cale did with people he found acceptable but did not choose. He did not look away from her. He pushed his broad head forward across the mud and set his chin on her knee. I had not, in 9 years, seen him do that with anyone. I pressed my back against the nearest pine, and I breathed very carefully, the way you breathe when something has happened that you were not prepared for, and you need a moment to sort out what it means. She made a small sound, not quite a word, something softer, and one of her hands came down very slowly onto the top of his head between his ears. She did not pet him the way people pet animals they are uncertain of, with quick nervous strokes. She set her hand there and held it, the way you hold your hand on something you want to steady. Cale's eyes closed. The night was cold. The pine margin was dark except for the half-moon and the faint orange glow from one lit window somewhere behind me in the village proper. I stood in the trees and watched my werewolf sleep on a packless laundress's daughter's knee, and I understood something that I had been refusing to understand for perhaps longer than I was prepared to admit. The bond does not always arrive like a blow. I had heard it described that way, the strike of recognition, the flare, the sudden heat behind the ribs that announces itself as fact. My father had described it that way. 3 of my captains had described it that way. I had spent 16 years on the border half expecting it in that form, the moment when a woman walked into a room and the world changed shape in a single breath. What I felt, standing in the trees at the edge of the packless village, watching her hold her hand steady on my wolf's head, was not a blow. It was more like a door swinging open that I had not known was closed. Not sudden, or it was sudden only in the way that understanding a thing you have been circling for a long time can feel sudden when it finally lands. A warmth behind my ribs, a recognition that was not quite sight and not quite instinct and was, I thought, something more precise than either. She was my mate. I knew it the way I knew a fixed point in the dark by its position relative to everything else. not because I could see it clearly, but because everything around it arranged itself in relation to it, and there was no other explanation for the arrangement. I stood in the trees for a long time after that, long enough that the half-moon moved, long enough that the cold worked its way through my campaign leathers and made my injured shoulder ache. I stood there and I thought about 16 years, which is a specific and not comfortable thing to think about when you have just understood that the answer was at the village edge, and you had been riding this road since before she was. I stopped that thought. I did not know how old she was. I did not know anything about her except that she had come out in the dark to tend a wounded wolf she had no reason to help, and she had gotten him still when 9 years of bond and loyalty was what it took to get him still for me. I did not have a word for what that made me feel. I had several words for what it made me intend, which is perhaps a more useful way for a king to think. She fell asleep somewhere in the deep hours before dawn. Not intentionally, she had stayed awake to watch the wolf's breathing, making sure the bound wound held and the animal did not try to move, and at some point her head tipped sideways and her eyes closed and she did not open them again. Kale did not move. His great side rose and fell with a steadiness that told me the herbs had done their work, that the blood had stopped, that the immediate danger had passed. I watched her sleep for a while. That sounds like a strange thing to say, and perhaps it is, but I want to say it plainly because I do not want to describe it as anything other than what it was. A man who had just understood something significant, standing in the dark at a respectful distance, watching the person the understanding was about and taking account of what he saw. What I saw was this: a girl, perhaps 22 or 23, with dark hair loosened from a work braid and mud on her knees and herb stain on both hands, and a composure, even in sleep, that was not the composure of someone who had never been through difficulty. It was the composure of someone who had been through difficulty often enough that they had found the bedrock beneath it and learned to rest there. She had not run when Kale appeared at her trough. She had come out of her house, probably pulled from sleep by the sound of an animal at the water, and she had seen a war wolf, an animal that stood to my shoulder, that could scatter a line of armed men when he chose, that bore the Vorthing border mark burned into his flank, and she had not run. She had brought her basin and her herbs. I thought about that for a long time in the dark, too. The sky began to lighten behind the pine ridge to the east. Not quickly. The March's winter does not give you a gentle dawn. It gives you a slow gray lifting, the dark thinning to the color of old iron before anything warmer appears. I watched it come. I had watched it come on 100 mornings on 100 different stretches of the border, and I had never stood still for it the way I stood still for it now, with my back against the pine and my arms crossed, and my mind doing the quiet work of deciding what I was going to do. What I was going to do was not complicated. It was only new. When the gray had lifted enough that I could see her face clearly and Kale's bound flank and the wet grass around the trough, I stepped out of the trees. I walked across the open ground between the pine margin and the trough, and I was perhaps 10 yards from her when Kale opened his eyes. He did not lift his head. He looked at me from her knee with an expression I had seen on his face very rarely in 9 years. Not the wariness he showed strangers, not the bright alertness he showed a fight, but something slower and more settled. Something that said, "I know you, and I know what you are looking at, and I have been waiting for you to arrive." I stopped moving when I was close enough that she would be able to see my face clearly when she opened her eyes. She opened her eyes a moment later. The light was enough by then that I could see the exact sequence of it. The slow surface upward from sleep, the awareness of cold and wet grass and an aching hip from the position she had held, and then the awareness of the large wolf still across her feet, and then, a breath later, the awareness of a man standing 10 yards away watching her wake. She did not make a sound. She looked at me, and her hands, by some reflex of attention, moved to Kale's flank to check the binding before they moved anywhere else. That, too, I will remember for as long as I live. The wound held, I said. It was not perhaps the most eloquent opening for the conversation I was having. But it was true, and it was the first thing she had checked, and it seemed right to answer the question she had asked with her hands before she had asked anything with words. Yes, she said. Her voice was steady. She was frightened. I could see that plainly. She would have been a fool not to be frightened, a stranger in the pre-dawn dark, but the fear was below the steadiness, not on top of it. The bleeding had stopped before the second hour. The yarrow held. You know yarrow work. I know field medicine. My father was a traveling trader. You pick things up when there are no healers for 50 miles. Your father, I said, not a pack healer. We had no pack, she said, no apology in it, the same bedrock composure I had read in her sleeping face. He traveled. I stayed when he could no longer travel. There was work here. I looked at her hands. The herb stain and the dried blood were both on them, Cale's blood, which is not a small thing. Cale's blood on a person's hands means they were close enough to sustain contact through pain, which most people cannot manage. Most trained healer wolves cannot manage it. She had managed it on her first encounter with the animal in the dark, alone, with no training in wolf handling and no particular reason to stay. I looked at Cale, who was still across her feet and showed no interest in moving. I looked at her wrist. The bond mark was there. I had not seen it in the dark. It had not been there to see in the dark, or if it had I had missed it in the shadow and the distance, but in the gray morning light it was unmistakable. A thin line of warmth along the inside of her left wrist, not quite gold and not quite silver, the color of firelight on water. The bond mark, which arrives on the mate of an alpha king when recognition is mutual, which means it arrives when both parties have, in some form, already known. She had been looking at me. Now she looked down at her wrist, and the steadiness held for another moment, and then she said, very quietly, "That was not there last night." "No," I said, "it was not." "What is it?" "It is a mark that belongs to exactly one thing," I said. "And I will explain it to you fully and honestly, and you will have the full account before I ask anything of you at all. That is a promise." She looked at me for a long moment. Cale's breathing was even and slow beneath her hand. "You are the king," she said. It was not quite a question. "Aldrich Vorthin," I said. "Yes." She absorbed this in silence. Not the silence of fear. I knew by then what her fear looked like, and this was not it. This was the silence of a woman who has been handed an unexpected fact, and is placing it carefully in relation to all the other facts she holds. The way a person sorts objects in the dark by touch, finding where each one fits before moving to the next. "The wolf is yours," she said. "He is. His name is Cale. He has ridden with me for 9 years. He came to my trough." "Yes." I did not know whose he was. "I know," I said. "That is why I am standing here telling you before I ask anything else." Another silence. She looked at the mark on her wrist again, and then at Cale, and then at me. "You were in the trees," she said. She had known. Not all of it, not who I was, not what she was looking at when Cale's chin went to her knee, but she had known at some point in the night that there was someone in the tree line. I had thought I was still enough. Apparently I had not been. "Yes," I said. There was no useful point in denying it. "For how long?" "Most of the night." She considered this. "You could have come out." "I could have. I chose not to." I met her eyes and I said it plainly, because she deserved plainness. "I wanted to see what you would do when no one was watching. I have spent 16 years on this border, and I have learned that people will do almost anything when someone important is watching. I wanted to know what you did in the dark with no audience and no benefit to yourself." "And what did I do?" "You cleaned his wound," I said. "You gave him your herbs and your cloth and your warmth. You talked to him so he would not be frightened. You stayed through the cold so you could watch his breathing. And then you fell asleep with your hand on his head because you had been awake through the worst of it and your body ran out of argument." I paused. You did exactly what you would have done if I had been standing in the open. That is not a small thing." Something moved across her face that was not quite surprise and not quite the composure she had been holding. Something between them, warmer than either, the expression of a person who has been seen plainly by someone and found it startling because it does not often happen. "He was hurt," she said simply. "Yes. You do not leave hurt things alone if you can help them." "No," I said, "you do not." Cale chose this moment to lift his head from her knee, turn it with great deliberateness, and set his nose against the mark on her wrist. Not to sniff it, he had already known, already made his accounting of it in the night, but in the way a wolf presses close to something it has claimed, something it has decided belongs in its circle. He held there for a moment and then laid his chin back down, satisfied. She looked at his great head on her feet. She looked at the mark on her wrist. She looked at me. "Explain it," she said. "The mark you said you would." "I will," I said. And I sat down on the edge of the trough, which is, I will freely admit, not the posture of a king meeting his fated mate for the first time, and I told her. I told her about the bond, about what it means among Lycan bloodlines, what the mark is, why it appears when it does. I told her it is not a command and not a claim, and not an obligation she had not agreed to, that it is a recognition, which is a different thing. That recognition can be declined, that I had seen it declined once in my father's generation, and the two people involved had simply lived their lives at a distance from one another, which had not been comfortable for either of them but had been possible. That I was not going to tell her what it meant for her future. That I was going to tell her what I understood it to mean for mine, which is that she was the person I had spent 16 years not quite finding, and that I wanted, if she was willing, in whatever time frame she chose, on whatever terms she set, to know her. She listened without interrupting. She had the quality, which I came to understand over the weeks that followed was very characteristic of her, of listening with her whole attention, not gathering arguments while another person speaks, but actually hearing. It is rarer than you would expect. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You have a boarder to run," she said. "I do. And I have wash to finish. There are 4 households waiting on linens." I looked at her. There was a brightness in her eyes that was not quite amusement and not quite tears, something that belonged to both registers at once, the particular expression of a person who finds that life has arranged itself in an unexpected direction, and does not quite know whether to laugh or weep, and has decided, in the meantime, to be practical. "The linens can wait," I said. "They cannot, actually. 2 of the families have children." "Then the linens will be done," I said, "and I will send someone to do them, and you will come to the keep." "You will send someone to do my work." "You will come to the keep," I said again. "Not as a prisoner and not as a servant and not as anything you have not agreed to be. You will come as a guest, which means you will have a room and a fire and food and the freedom to leave whenever you choose. Cale will come with you, and he will not leave your doorway, which I suspect you will find either reassuring or very inconvenient depending on the hour." I paused. "I would like to keep talking to you, under conditions that are warmer than this." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at the mark on her wrist. Then she looked at Cale, who had opened one eye and was watching the conversation with what I can only describe as an interested calm, the expression of an animal who has already done his part and is content to see the slower parties catch up. "All right," she said, "but I finished the Aldenmore linens first. They have 4 children and the eldest has a cough." "Agreed," I said. And then, because it seemed important to say it before the rest of the morning arrived and made everything official and formal in ways that would require different words, I stood in the trees for most of a night watching you take care of something that was mine, and what I saw was the steadiest, most unhurried courage I have encountered on this border. I wanted you to know that, before anything else. She was quiet for a moment, then he was frightened. "Yes. You do not leave frightened things alone either," she said, if you can help them." It was not quite the same thing I had said to her, and it was not quite a different thing either. She had taken my words and held them up to the light and found what was underneath them, and given that back to me. I had the distinct, disorienting sense of being seen with the same precision I had just offered her. It was not a sensation I was accustomed to. It was also, I found, one I was not at all inclined to step away from. I nodded once and did not say anything else about it. My Sergeant Draven arrived at the edge of the pine margin 20 minutes later with 6 men, the keep's head healer, and a profoundly diplomatic expression that told me he had been standing at the tree line for considerably longer than 20 minutes and had decided to wait for an appropriate moment. He was a good sergeant. He had always had excellent judgment about when a commanding officer needed space to conduct his business without an audience. The head healer knelt beside Kale and examined the bound wound with the careful attention of someone who expected to find fault, and was in the process of discovering that there was no particular fault to find. "Yaropak," he said, "applied correctly. The channel is clean. Whoever did this," he looked up. He looked at Senna. He looked at her hands. "You did this." "Yes," Senna said. "You are not a trained healer." "No. He let you touch the wound." "He came to my trough," she said. "I did not go looking for him." The healer looked at me. I looked back at him in a way that communicated that further commentary was not required. He returned to examining the wound. Draven, to his very considerable credit, said nothing at all. He stood at the edge of the pine margin with his hands behind his back and looked at the middle distance with an expression of complete professional blankness that told me, very clearly, that he had already understood everything and had the excellent wisdom to keep it to himself. The other 5 men did not have Draven's discipline, but they were soldiers and they understood authority, and when they looked at the mark on her wrist, and then at me, and then at each other, they did it quickly and then looked somewhere else. There was a moment, after the healer had finished and Kale had been assisted to his feet, and was standing with his shoulder leaning against Senna's hip with the cheerful lack of embarrassment of an animal who has decided that this is now how things are. There was a moment when I looked at my sergeant and my men and the healer, and I understood that what had happened at this trough in the pre-dawn dark was not a private matter anymore. It had become the kind of thing that spreads through a hold in a day. The kind of thing that becomes a story. The kind of thing that people who were not present will describe to people who were not present, changing details as stories change, keeping the center because the center is the part that is true. The center of this story was simple. The king's werewolf had gone to the Packless village in the dark, wounded, and a girl with no rank and no wolf and no appointment had tended it through the night because it was hurt, and she did not leave hurt things alone if she could help them. And the wolf had chosen her, and the mark had come. I wanted the hold to know the center correctly. I wanted them to know her name. I turned to Draven. "Her name is Senna," I said, loudly enough that all 6 men heard it. "She held Kale through the night. The wound is clean because of what she did. You will remember her name, and you will use it." "Yes, my king," Draven said, without any change of expression whatsoever. I looked at Senna. She was looking at me. The bond mark on her wrist caught the morning light, the gray iron winter light of the marches, which is not warm light, but it was warm enough to show the mark clearly. Gold and silver, firelight on water, the color of something that has been here longer than either of us. "The Aldenmore linens," I said. "The Aldenmore linens," she agreed. I sent 2 of the men to assist with the Aldenmore linens. I sent the healer back to the keep with Kale, who went with the specific reluctance of a wolf who wants you to understand that he is only going because he has been asked, and he will be at her door before nightfall, and that is simply how things are now. I stayed at the trough with Senna while she gathered her basin and her remaining herbs and the strips she had not used, and I walked with her back through the village as it woke, doors opening, early risers stopping to look. The particular stillness that falls over a community when something unexpected is walking through it. And I carried her basin because it seemed like the right thing to do, and because I was, despite 16 years of practice at being a practical man, discovering that, in her company, I was not very interested in being only practical. She told me about the Aldenmore family during the walk. 4 children, ages 2 through 9. The eldest had a winter cough that had gone on 3 weeks, and she had been bringing them broth herbs with the laundry when she could spare them from her own stores. She said this, the way she said everything, without drama, without expectation of notice, as a simple accounting of what was true, as if it had not occurred to her that it was a fact anyone would find remarkable. I thought about the wash house, which I had ridden past for 16 years without giving it a name or a thought. I thought about the stores she had mentioned, her own stores, which would not have been large. I thought about the Aldenmore children and the broth herbs that had been arriving with the clean laundry from a girl who had no reason to spare them and had been doing it anyway. "How long have you been leaving herbs with the laundry?" I asked. "The Aldenmores, since the middle of last winter. The coughs always come in the second cold snap." "And the other families?" She glanced at me. "The Ferret Row houses get dried fennel when their wells run slow in summer because the water gets bad and the children get stomach sickness from it. The grain store family gets valerian when the old man can't sleep, which is most of the year. The timber family—" She stopped. "You are going to tell me this is not my business?" "No," I said. She waited. "I am going to tell you," I said, "that I have had a border hold healer on staff for 9 years who does not go to the Packless village. I am going to tell you that this is a failure of my administration that I intend to correct. And I am going to ask you, if you are willing, to tell me everything you know about the needs of the workers' row, because it is clear that you know considerably more about them than I do." A pause. "You are the king," she said again, but differently than she had said it the first time at the trough. This time it was not an establishing of fact. It was something between a question and a recognition. "Yes," I said, "which means the Packless village is my village too. It took me too long to understand that clearly. I would like to understand it better." She looked at me for a long moment as we walked. Then she said, "The Ferret Row wells need a new stone lining on the east side. The Timber family has a daughter who has had a bad shoulder since she fell from the stacking frame last autumn, and no one has looked at it. The grain store roof leaked through the summer, and the grain on the north side is beginning to mold, which is going to be a problem before spring." She paused. "Also, the Aldenmore eldest's cough is in his chest now, not just his throat, and he needs a healer's assessment, not broth herbs." I carried her basin and I listened, and I thought about the road I had ridden for 16 years and what had been on either side of it that I had not stopped to look at. When we reached the keep in the late morning, Senna walking through the gate with the air of someone who has decided to go somewhere new and intends to do it steadily. Draven was waiting at the inner door with an expression that said he had spent the past 2 hours ensuring that the entire keep understood that something significant had occurred and that they were to behave accordingly. The keep's household staff were in the inner yard. The pack officers who had ridden back from the crossing last night were in the inner yard. Several of the senior wolves who lived within the keep's walls were in the inner yard. They had all managed to find reasons to be in the inner yard at this particular moment, which told me that Draven had spent the past 2 hours ensuring something slightly different than I had imagined. He had ensured that they were all present. I stopped inside the gate. "Her name is Senna," I said, to the inner yard and everyone in it. My sergeant's voice, which is not a quiet voice. I had used it for 16 years on the border, and it carried to every corner of the yard without effort. She held my werewolf through the night when he was wounded and could not make it back to the keep. She is the only person outside this household who has ever gotten Kale still. She is a Packless worker's daughter from the Western Row, and she has been quietly caring for the Packless village for the better part of 2 years while my healer did not go there. She will be a guest of this hold for as long as she chooses. You will know her name and use it. That is all. Silence in the inner yard. The kind of silence that is not empty, the kind that is very full of calculation and adjustment, and the quiet sound of a community reordering what it knows. Cale appeared from the direction of the kennels. He had, apparently, decided that the healer's care was complete and that his time was better spent elsewhere. He walked across the inner yard without looking at anyone, reached Senna's side, and sat down on her left foot. He stayed there for the rest of the morning. The weeks that followed were not without complication. There is no version of a king meeting his fated mate at a packless trough in the pre-dawn dark that is without complication. There was the matter of the council, which had opinions. There was the matter of several border families who had been quietly hoping for an alliance match and found the hope retiring without ceremony. There was the matter of Senna herself, who required several weeks of careful conversation before she was persuaded that the bond mark and my intentions were not two separate things she had to evaluate separately. That they were, in fact, the same thing, pointing in the same direction for the same reasons. She was not, I should say, persuaded easily. This was not because she was reluctant. It was because she was careful. She had been a packless wanderer's daughter in a border village for long enough that she had learned the difference between a thing that appeared to be solid and a thing that actually was, and she did not commit to solid things until she had tested them with her full weight. I was glad of it. I would rather be tested and trusted than assumed and regretted. She asked me questions over those weeks that no one had asked me in 16 years of border kingship. Not about the border or the hold or the pack hierarchy or the bond. She had absorbed all of that with the same focused attention she had brought to Cale's wound. She asked me about my father, who had died when I was 19 and left me a border I was not certain I knew how to run. She asked me about the night 3 winters ago when the crossing had held by 8 men, and I had ridden back with 7. She asked me about the packless village, repeatedly and from many angles, until she was satisfied that my intention to understand it better was not a thing I had said in the morning light by a trough and would forget by afternoon. I did not forget. I sent the keep's healer to the workers' row the first week. The Aldenmore boy was seen. The Ferret Row wells were examined. The grain store roof was repaired before the first heavy snow. I will not claim that these were grand gestures of governance. They were corrections, which is a different thing and perhaps a more honest one. Senna saw what I was doing. She did not say much about it. But one morning, early in the 4th week, she arrived at the inner courtyard from the direction of the workers' row. She had been going back regularly to see the families, to finish the work she had started before the night at the trough, and she stopped when she saw me and she said, "The Aldenmore boy is better." "I know," I said. "The healer told me." "You asked?" "Yes." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "The Ferret Row wells are better too. The new stone lining held through last week's frost." "Good. You could have done those things before." "Yes," I said. I should have. I am doing them now." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "All right." That was all. But she was looking at me the way she had looked at Cale's wound when she finally had it clean, with the satisfaction of someone who has checked a thing thoroughly and found it sound. 3 months after the night at the trough, in the first clear week of early spring when the marshland thawed and the pine margin showed its green again, I formally presented Senna to the full pack council of Vorthing Hold as my intended mate. Not a betrothal. She had made clear she did not want a ceremony, that she had not chosen the terms of, but a recognition, which is a different, and in some ways more substantial thing. I told the council the account of the night at the trough plainly, without embellishment, because the plain account was already more than sufficient. I told them what she had done, and why she had done it, and what the werewolf had chosen, and what the bond mark meant. The council was not without objection. There are always objections, and some of them were even reasonable objections, and I heard each one and answered it, and where I could not answer it I said so, and explained what I intended to do about it over time. This is governance. It is slower than authority, but it holds better. Kale was present at the council meeting because Senna was present, and Kale was not going to be in a room she was not in. He lay across her feet for the duration of the meeting, with an expression of complete unconcerned comfort that I suspected communicated more to the council than anything I said. Pack instinct runs deep. You can argue with a king's judgment. You cannot quite argue with what a werewolf chooses to trust. In the end, the council ratified the recognition without dissent, though 3 members waited until the others had spoken before they added their voices. This is how councils work. This too is governance. She chose the terms of the ceremony herself. 3 months after that, in midsummer, with the ceremony held in the inner courtyard of the keep rather than the great hall, because she said she had been in the inner courtyard the day she arrived, and it had seemed solid to her. The Workers' Row families were invited and came. The Aldenmore boy was there, recovered, running through the courtyard with the specific joyfulness of a child who has been very ill and come out the other side of it and finds the world inexplicably funny. Kale wore his bond mark, which appears on a werewolf's chest when his king's mate is confirmed, a match to the mark on her wrist, silver and gold, the color of firelight on water. I stood at the front of the inner courtyard, and I watched her walk across it toward me, and I thought about the pre-dawn dark at the trough, and the weight of her hand on Kale's head, and the moment the door had swung open in my chest, and I had understood. She was steady as she crossed the courtyard. She had been steady every day I had known her, through the discomfort of the weeks when the council was uncertain, through the adjustment of moving from the Workers' Row to the keep, through the long patient work of learning a hold and a pack and a king who was still learning himself, what it meant to let someone close. Steady the way the bedrock under a border river is steady, not rigid, not immovable but present, something you can build on. I will not describe the ceremony in detail, because it was hours, and I prefer to keep it so. What I will say is that when the bond mark on her wrist and the matching mark on mine were pressed together in the formal joining gesture, and the recognition was complete, Kale threw his head back and sounded, once, fully, the long note of a werewolf acknowledging something he has already known for months, and the whole courtyard was quiet for a moment after it, the kind of quiet that is full rather than empty. The Aldenmore boy, who had been told to be still during the ceremony and had done reasonably well at it, asked his mother in a whisper that carried to at least the first 3 rows why the wolf was singing. His mother shushed him. He asked again. Someone near the back laughed, and then several more people laughed, and the quiet broke open into the kind of warmth that fills a courtyard when something true has been allowed to be itself in public. It is 5 years ago now that she found Kale at the trough and cleaned his wound in the dark. I ride the border still, because the border does not stop requiring attention simply because the king has found his mate, and she has told me several times that she has no interest in a husband who stops doing the work his hold requires. This is one of the reasons I trust her judgment. She understands governance. She has understood it, in the specific way of someone who has governed the needs of a packless village on no resources for 2 years, considerably longer than I gave her credit for when I was riding past the wash house and not looking at it. The Packless Workers' Row has a full-time healer now, stationed there quarterly on rotation from the keep staff. The Ferret Row wells have been relined twice. The grain store has a new roof and a deputy manager from the hold's administration who visits monthly. These are not large things in the accounting of a border hold's governance. They are also not nothing. Senna does not take credit for them. She would tell you if you asked, that she simply described what she saw and I corrected what needed correcting, which is an accurate accounting of what happened and also, I think, somewhat incomplete. She has a habit of noticing. The kind of noticing that is a form of love, attentive, specific, without expectation of recognition, extended to the whole territory she moves through. Not just to Kale, though Kale remains her most devoted subject and still takes up the left side of our hearth with the cheerful immodesty of an animal who has always believed this was exactly where he was supposed to be. She noticed the Aldenmore boy. She noticed the ferret Roe Wells. She noticed the grain store roof. She noticed, though she did not say so until the second year we were married, and we were talking about the night at the trough in the way that you talk about things after they have become part of your life, and the distance gives you a different view. She noticed, that night at the trough, that there was someone in the tree line. She had known from nearly the beginning. "Why didn't you say so?" I asked. She thought about it for a moment, the way she thinks about things that she has already thought about before and is now finding the right words for. "Because you needed to see what I did when no one was watching," she said. "You told me so, and I thought that was fair, so I decided to do what I would have done if you weren't there." A pause. "Which was the same thing I was already doing." "Yes," I said. "He was hurt," she said, simply. The same words she had used 5 years ago in the morning light, and they meant the same thing now that they had meant then. She had no more complicated explanation for it than that. It had been the right thing to do, so she had done it. I thought about that for a long time. I think I will think about it for the rest of my life.